morning, my name is Lynn. Welcome to Prairie Point's Quilt Shop in Ponoka, Alberta. Today we're going to talk about bindings. There are several different ways to do bindings, and I want to show you some of our favorite ways to do them in this shop. There are two different ways to do bindings. You can do straight cut binding, which means you cut it across the width of the fabric, and you can do bias binding. For bias binding, it's better for curves and anytime you're doing anything with a wave in it. For straight binding, it's fine for just doing a quilt just straight on, a regular square rectangle quilt. To do straight binding, you want to lay your first piece of fabric down, bulk of it to the left side. You put your second piece of fabric with the bulk of it in front of you, and what we're going to do is we're going to overlap it. So you've got this little V notch up in here. This is where we're going to use this wonderful half square triangle ruler made by Omnigrid. And on it, it has some markings. This marking here is a dog ear that's going to show the top of the binding as to exactly where we need to cut it. So I'm going to take this little bit here, I'm going to stick it right down so it is directly horizontal with the piece that's going to the left and vertical with the piece that's going up and down. We're going to run this down as a right angle, and we've actually got now lined up on the 2-inch line across here. This is a 2.5-inch strip of binding. So we've got it lined up on the 2-inch. So when I cut this off, I'm going to have this wonderful little notch to sew in between so that I'm going to get a perfect joined piece of binding. Because I'm a bit of a klutz, I like to stick a couple of pins in just to hold things in place nice and neatly, and then I know for sure that there hasn't been any movement. I have a 1/4-inch foot on my sewing machine, and what I'm going to do when I drop this is sew in between the two notches. Avoiding the pins as I go. So when we open it up, you can see that the two pieces are nice and flush. We just need to press now to make our double fold binding. To press your binding, you want to press the one edge over. I'm now folding the binding in half, where I'm just going to press the two raw edges together. When I make a large amount of binding, I actually like to roll it up at one end. It just keeps it a little neater. We are now ready to apply the binding to our quilt. So for a 2.5-inch binding, when you've folded it in half, it should be 1.25 inches. So when we're putting the binding on our quilt, we actually want to sew it about just shy of 1/3 of the way up. So in this case, it's going to be just over 1/3 of an inch. And what we're going to do, because we machine add our binding, is we're actually going to add it to the back to bring it over to the front, where we're going to actually stitch it down by machine. If you want to stitch it down by hand, you're going to want to put it from the front, flipping it over to the back. But we're going to do it backwards. Here is our quilt, which is just a shop sample for free motion, and we are ready to go. To start this process, you're going to want to leave quite a bit of a tail. This will become evident at the end of the project. There's no need to anchor it. And I know from having done this on this machine that if I use my open-toed foot, that I'm exactly where I need to be with my needle. My stitch length is set to approximately 2.5. So I'm ready to go. I'm going to cruise along until I get down to about the same distance from here to here at the corner, from here to the corner. And that's where I'm actually going to sew off the edge. So I'm going to pick my presser foot up, give my quilt a 1/4 turn, and I'm going to come off at a 45-degree angle. What this is going to allow me to do is fold up the rest of the tail and bring it back down again, which is going to create that perfect miter that we're all looking for. So what we'll do is we'll fold it up, fold it back down again. So we have everything encompassed, and if you actually flip it up, you can tell that there's going to be a perfect 45-degree angle in there. And I'll bring it back under my machine, put my presser foot back down so the edge is next to my edge of my quilt, And I'm going to start right at the edge without anchoring. I'm going to repeat this for all 4 corners. Last corner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave at least an 8-inch hole where I'm going to be joining the 2 pieces of binding together. So I'm going to come down here just a part ways and finish it off. This is a really great method for joining your binding. I can't remember where I saw it, but it does work every time. You have in front of you your left tail and your right tail. You're going to put your left tail on the bottom. Bring it across the span. You're going to take the right tail and bring it across the span again. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to snip through all 4 layers so that I actually have a little notch in there. I'm going to pull the right tail back, lift the left tail up, and actually cut that off. This now becomes my template. Move the left tail out of the way so you don't accidentally snip it. Bring the right tail back, look for your notch. Open this up because this is your width of your binding. Put your one edge to the left of your notch. Bring the other across, and of course I've caught the join, which is going to make it a little more challenging, but it's still doable. Try to plan that better. And now I don't need this template anymore, so I'm going to put it aside. So I now have 2 pieces that are overlapping, and they'll be the 2.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up the bottom right and the top left. So I've got the 2 corners. I'm going to put these 2 corners together. Take 2 pins to hold them into place. To test to make sure it fits, I'm going to bring my binding over, and you can see that I'm right at the notch. And I'll bring my binding over to this side. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sew from this angle to this angle. You can mark it with a pencil, or you can just eyeball it. We're going to eyeball this. Cut the thread. So when I pull this now, it should fit tight. So what I'm going to do is test it, make sure it's exactly where I want it. Take this excess tail inside here, clip it away. I'm now going to press this to get this nice and flat so that I don't have any bumps. And now I'll just continue my seam down to finish the edge. So we are now ready to turn our binding over to attach it. We're going to go from the back to the front of the quilt, and we're going to have a little stitch along the edge. A lot faster than doing it by hand. We're now ready to clip the corners off. This was the edge that I had a little bit of problem with, so I'm just going to take that bulk away first and clip off the corner. Clip off the corner. And what this is going to do is allow our miters to perfectly form. So what I've learned over time is to now press this binding into place. Which gives it a little more crispness when you're ready to turn it. So we'll be turning our binding over to the front of our quilt. This is where we're going to go back to our 1/4 inch foot now. And the reason we're going to use our 1/4 inch foot is because in it has a built-in guide that we can use. So as you are sewing along, what you're going to try to do is match the edge of your binding against the edge of the foot. This is the left-hand side. And when you're stitching through, you're going to be approximately 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of your foot. If we've put this on correctly and we have more than 2/3 left, when we roll this over, we'll actually be over our stitching line. So I can feel with my finger that the edge of the binding is actually right here, which gives me a little bit of playroom that I'm going to have a stitch running down the edge of the binding on the back side. On the front side, what I'll have is a row of stitching when it is over the line here. What I will have is a row of stitching in here. That's going to be perfectly fine for kids' quilts and anything you're not entering into any juried competitions. The first thing I'm going to do is adjust my stitch length out to about 3.5 because you really don't want to see a really tight stitch on your binding. So we're going to put part of this on traditionally with nothing in it, and then we're going to add a bit of rickrack to the other side just to make it interesting. So now that I've got this all in place, I'm going to pull it over, and I'm going to test to make sure that I'm over my back stitching line. We're going to put the presser foot down and line up the edge of the foot against the edge of the binding. And we're ready to go. I'm using a contrasting thread so that you can actually see what we're doing here. If we were actually doing this on a proper quilt, we would want to match the top thread to the binding and the bobbin thread to the back of the quilt, and which makes it almost invisible. In fact, people quite often ask, how did you do that? So as we're coming down, we're going to get to the corner, and that's the next big question, is how do you get that beautiful miter? So I'll bring it down, I'm going to pull it nice and tight, and then when I flip it over, actually the binding itself creates the miter again. And what I'm wanting to do when I stitch down to this point is get one stitch into the next side before I actually pivot it. So I'm holding everything in place. I've got that one stitch now, and I'm ready to give this thing a quarter turn, which will then allow the binding to actually stay in place where it's supposed to be. So we're going to come down this side a little more, and then on the next long side I'll show you how to put some rickrack in, which is really fun. Okay, so now we're getting close to the edge. I'm going to take my piece of rickrack and I'm actually going to lay it here inside the corner. So when you're attaching rickrack or pom-pom or some kind of a decorative trim, you'll actually want to do it in individual sections. And what I try to do is get the tail tucked in. Each edge, and then just clip it when you get to the other end. So I'm not actually going to generally take it off the spool until I'm ready to give it a final clipping. So we'll give this a pull over here and a pull up here. And we're getting a little finicky with that little bit of trim in there. Okay, so I've caught all my layers. We'll give it that turn again. So I'm going to attempt now to get the trim to center onto the stitching from below. This adds a really fun dimension to your quilt, especially kids' quilts or table toppers. We did a cake plate mat and ended up adding a little bit of pink rickrack to it. It actually looks like icing. So now that I'm getting closer to my end, what I'm wanting to do now is clip off any excess. And then this now will tuck nicely into the corner as we're ready to take the corner. That thumping noise is when you can tell when I've actually missed the back of the quilt and I'm actually going through all the layers, including the binding on the back. So when you hear that thumping noise, it's important to stop, back up, pick out that few stitches and carry on, or you will actually end up with some of your stitching on the binding. So we're ready to have a look at the front of it. So this is what it looks like. So you've got a nice row of stitching with a tail of thread on here, a nice row of stitching down the edge of your binding. We've actually got some rickrack worked into this side, and when you turn it over, you can actually see a very thin row of stitching right next to your binding on the back. And if this was actually done in ivory thread, you wouldn't even notice it was there. And that's how we put binding on at Prairie Points Quilt Shop in Ponoka.